NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg's Conundrum. NATO expansion's two-edged sword as China's threats to Europe comes into focus. Outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg completed a 5-day visit to the United States and Canada on Friday, June 21, 2024. Secretary Stoltenberg visited the two countries ahead of the Washington NATO summit in July, where NATO heads of state and their partner countries will meet. This will mark the final NATO summit for Secretary Stoltenberg, as it seems former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, the last remaining candidate for the position, will replace him. He received support from Hungary and Slovakia, and the Romanian president withdrew from the race. October 24 marks the end of Stoltenberg's term. Despite his term coming to an end, Secretary Stoltenberg is still attempting to strengthen NATO and lobby for support for his initiatives with NATO leaders ahead of the Washington summit. These policies appear to include greater focus on China and its perceived threat to NATO partners, particularly European security, but many obstacles remain. 12 founding members formed NATO in 1949 as a collective defense agreement to protect and deter potential Soviet aggression in Central and Western Europe. Until the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991, NATO, the longest-lasting military alliance in history, successfully deterred any Soviet expansion in Europe. This marked the unofficial end of the Cold War and the Soviet threat to Europe. The withdrawal of Soviet forces back to European Russia seemed to signal an end of the need for NATO. However, NATO continued to exist, despite significant reductions in both its contributing armed forces and Russia's armed forces. Despite appearing to lack a clear mission, NATO continued to fulfill its traditional role for a threat that did not seem to exist. NATO did find a mission in that it started expanding its membership as it moved into Eastern Europe and into the former Soviet-aligned states. Having been under Soviet domination since the end of World War II, many of these states were eager to gain some security from Soviet-Russian influence or control, and they saw NATO as a tool to achieve this security. NATO was willing to expand not only to gain influence, but also to argue that NATO was a force for European security and stability. One can argue that NATO offers both security and stability in Europe, but the question still stands: what kind of security does it offer? The Russian Federation, the largest European nation and non-NATO armed force, served as the progenitor of the Soviet Union. As it appears that NATO and its new Eastern European member states still saw Russia as a threat. Soviet Union Russia has been twice invaded in the 20th century by Germany and its allies, and had cost the Soviet and Russian people over 30 million of its citizens. The Soviet occupation and dominance of Eastern Europe states were part of the Soviet policy to create a buffer zone of friendly states to protect the Soviet Union, Russia, from being a victim of further devastating invasions. It was unlikely that the West would consent to an invasion of the Soviet Union, given its firm occupation and control over West Germany. However, one could argue that the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was simply unwilling to heed the West's assurances. For its part, the West, having witnessed Stalin's hostility towards them and his promotion of revolution, refused to take his word at face value, especially after witnessing him turn against his former allies of World War II. NATO saw its purpose in providing stability and security in the memory and legacy of Stalin, who dominated and controlled Eastern Europe for its own security and welfare. NATO expanded from the original 12 states at its founding to now 32 states, and it is arguably much stronger relative to its potential threats than ever before. This is a measure of its military strength, but it's unclear and unproven whether the alliance is stronger and may actually be weaker. NATO's strength lies in its Article 5 guarantees, which simply state that an attack on one is an attack on all, and all member states will come to the defense of the attacked state. When NATO was founded in 1949, if it was attacked by the Soviet Union, it was a certainty that Article 5 was ironclad. Is that true now? If attacked, for example, would a small Western European country be willing to assist a small Eastern European country, or vice versa? What if the threat didn't pose an existential threat to its security? These are unanswered questions, and that is the problem. If there is a question about universal acceptance of Article 5, then the alliance has what could be a fatal fault line in its existence. Post-Cold War Russia, for the most part, was not a threat to Europe, though it had armed conflicts within the old Soviet borders, with Chechnya and Georgia, for example, and it was not considered a threat. But that significantly changed in 2014 in Ukraine. NATO was now geographically closer to these conflicts, and it took notice. But for the most part, Russia was not focusing on its former Warsaw Pact buffer states or NATO. At this point, NATO shifted its focus to Ukraine, having flirted with the idea of Ukraine joining NATO in 2008, a move that faced fierce Russian opposition. However, the 2014 invasion of Ukraine gave NATO a renewed purpose. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 had moved NATO from just renewed purpose to the forefront of European security due to the Ukraine war and its deep-rooted anti-Russian DNA. The Ukraine war was rightfully elevated NATO to the forefront of the security discourse, given that war poses a threat to the security of NATO members, even though NATO's expansions played a role in this war. Under Secretary Stoltenberg, NATO has increased its defense spending and focused on its long-neglected defense forces and defense industrial sector. NATO's expansion did not mean that its member states took security seriously, and the war in Ukraine war from 2022 to the present has revealed the atrophy of armed forces dedicated to the NATO countries. The war has also revealed the policy disagreements among NATO countries over the conflict in Ukraine. These disagreements cast further doubt on the commitments of all members under Article 5. NATO needs to find a middle ground in policy that will shore up countries' commitment to Article 5. Any significant NATO policy decision necessitates unanimous consent, and if NATO pursues a policy without this consent, it jeopardizes its existence when a unanimous Article 5 agreement is most crucial. For instance, if NATO opts for a policy path with only a slender support, it creates a scenario where the need to invoke Article 5 arises, yet only 29 out of 32 countries provide support. These three dissenters not only prevent the implementation of Article 5, but they also have the potential to thwart any other policies that attempt to advance Article 5 support, as they require unanimous support. NATO could find itself in a situation where a member country is facing a crisis and debating whether to provide support. The unanimous consent clause of NATO dictates that it must either maintain a small membership of countries that share a common goal or narrowly focus its common goals to ensure unanimous consent of all members. NATO instead has opted for expansion, necessitating a narrowly focused policy to uphold its Article 5 commitments. However, under Stoltenberg's leadership, NATO has embraced expansion and expansive policies, potentially exposing the organization's flaws, as demonstrated by the current crisis in response to the Ukraine war. NATO, instead of shoring up its support of its European members, has chosen to expand its regional focus. The war in Ukraine has led to a situation where China is becoming a focus for Europe and NATO. European leaders have stated that the Ukraine war is a threat to European security, which actually means they interpret Russia as a threat to European security. The war in Ukraine resulted in some of the broadest and harshest sanction regimes ever implemented against a country. As stated in past articles, there are intentional loopholes to allow Russia to sell its largest commodities, gas and oil, with only a few stipulations so that its energy is still available to the world. Despite these sanctions, the Russian economy continues to grow, and it is producing more war materials now prior than at the start of the war, despite the sanctions. China and Russia have maintained close ties throughout the war, and there are suspicions that China is assisting Russia in sustaining its war and expanding its defense industry. China is not directly selling arms to Russia, rather it is providing dual-use items, such as something that can be used both military and civilian applications, as well as heavy machinery parts to help it increase its defense factory outputs. Chinese companies are also heavily, but not exclusively involved in third-party sales of sanctioned goods to Russia. In this scenario, Chinese companies likely sell their products to a Central Asian country of the former Soviet Union, which then resells them to Russia. Along with India, China is also the largest purchaser of Russian energy, but this is the right-left nature of fungible product. Europe does not purchase Russian oil for the most part, but instead it purchases more Middle Eastern oil. Conversely, China purchases less Middle Eastern oil and purchases Russian oil that the Europeans no longer purchase. The Chinese support and lack of Chinese condemnation, combined with China's continued aggressive actions in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea, have led Europe to call China a threat to European security. The reasoning is that the war in Ukraine has been called a threat to European security, and thus China is helping Russia in its war. China is a culpable threat to Europe, therefore. NATO has followed the European statements and has taken an opportunity to increase its contacts in Asia, which has led to accusations from China that the U.S. is trying to add NATO or a NATO-like organization in the Pacific. Secretary Stoltenberg's efforts on behalf of NATO in Asia are not new, as the organization's outreach to the region predates the Ukraine war. However, the war has reignited the focus on Asia. The IP4, Indo-Pacific 4, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand have participated in NATO summits as part of NATO's outreach to Asia since 2022. NATO refers to these countries as like-minded partners who share the West's adherence to international rules-based order. IP4 can provide important information on the region's security situation and how it could impact the rules-based order, such as the free flow of commerce through the South China Sea. These IP4 partners can also play a role in technology sharing, intelligence gathering, and cyber warfare, as China has been active in espionage and cyber warfare against Europe, as well as providing support to Ukraine, the Ukraine war. Therefore, one would argue that China poses a threat to Europe, and IP4 countries can aid NATO in addressing these issues. The other area of interest that NATO has in the IP4 is weapons production. As the European and to a lesser extent U.S. defense industry struggle to support the war in Ukraine and increase the flow of military hardware to many long neglected NATO countries' armed forces, these countries have emerged as important partners in supporting the conflict. This is especially true of Japan and South Korea, which are not only supporting Ukraine, but also helping arm NATO nations. The IP4 nations also play a role in helping to get new military technologies developed and in production faster than ever before to get ahead of the Russian and Chinese threats. Secretary Stoltenberg's efforts to expand NATO's outreach have the support of the United States, which is focusing more on Asia and the China threat. The U.S. strategy includes the bolstering and formation of alliances in the region to make them more effective in countering China's aggressiveness in the region. France, seeing that the Chinese threat as an opportunity to increase its influence in Europe, at least partially opposes Stoltenberg and the U.S. efforts. France desires Europe to concentrate on Europe, enabling the U.S. to shift resources from Europe to Asia. France, as a leader, would assume leadership responsibility for bridging the security gap in Europe that the United States has left behind. This means that NATO needs to focus on resources on Europe and not on Asia. French President Emmanuel Macron has a valid point in that NATO is struggling with its European defense commitments and does not have the capacity, much less a mandate, to focus on Asia. President Macron does agree that China is a threat to Europe, but that it is a European Union issue and not a NATO issue. The issue lies in that the European Union lacks a lack of a military, necessitating the implementation of hard power diplomacy through military force by individual European states, the majority of which are European NATO members. Any commitments they make towards China to protect Europe will be relatively small and operate outside of NATO and the EU. These commitments will also weaken NATO just as it is trying to focus on the threats created by the Ukraine war. The U.S. does not want to establish NATO in Asia, but it wants to be able to leverage NATO military capabilities, including its own in Europe, to more readily move between Asia and Europe and back. Europe sees its economic threat from China as China outwardly threatens to use its excess industrial capacity for price dumping to weaken European industry and economies, limit its ability to support its defense buildup and support of Ukraine, and limit its flexibility to issue sanctions against China for supporting Russia in its war. NATO support for U.S. efforts against China can reinforce the European Union's and NATO's assertion that China poses a threat to European security. Secretary Stoltenberg's policy to expand NATO's role into Asia and allow IP4 nations to participate in NATO decision-making has merit in connecting the dots of European security and the Chinese threat. The problem lies in the fact that NATO's expansion into Europe is already too extensive to garner full consensus in Europe, thereby casting doubts on Article 5 guarantees. The war in Ukraine has also strained NATO's resources, and allocating additional resources to China would only broaden the alliance's focus rather than narrow it, potentially weakening it further in a crisis. IP4 plays a role in both NATO and European security, while NATO also plays a crucial role bolstering IP4's regional security, as both parties rely heavily on the maintenance of a rules-based order. How to bridge this issue between NATO, Europe, and Asia will be a tough obstacle for Mark Rutte to address.